Greetings, Baranina. This is my third effort to contact you. I'm doing it a little earlier today than I have in the past 2 days. I hope you're doing well. I want to discuss a topic that I think is very serious and needs to be addressed. First of all, for the record, let me just say that I am not going to be subjected to any effort to try to compel me to prescribe or identify myself as a member or adherent of any particular religious tendency going forward. There's a separation of church and state in the United States for a reason, but I will acknowledge that for at least the last 5 to 10 years, actually, in one level or another, I have been subjected to some sort of heinous persecutorial religious test that's unconstitutional. I believe it was in an effort to try to slander and defame me. It's connected to very significant racism, as well as acts of anti Semitism. And I also believe it is aimed at an attempt to try to alter timelines as an effort at genetic engineering. I'm rather concerned that at the essence of this is a long term eugenicist paradigm that has refused to actually discuss cybernetics and the intersection of biology as well as things like robotics or the digital economy, which can be discussed rationally and for which people can be prepared to engage in an ethical manner, because there was an emphasis on some sort of economic and political engineering paradigm that wanted to exacerbate actual physical sickness and illness in order to proliferate priorities around the biomedical sector and concepts of healthcare and medical technology. I personally don't agree with this politically, and I think that it actually has been very devastating in terms of socio political development domestically and internationally. I also think it is at the core of a variety of paradigms that have misrepresented the relationship between healthcare, including healthcare connected to emergency provision of healthcare, as well as the means by which bodies are engaged in acts of war, including warfare connected to weapons development, and that we have had a protracted period of time of misrepresentation of things that would otherwise qualify as a banned weapon or a weapon that would need a specific kind of contextualization in order to use safely, and have allowed for that to be mischaracterized, including the processes of its development to be mischaracterized as alleged healthcare. And at the core of that is a means by which to actually take people's skills, talents, and actual biologics and biological properties and allow them to be copyrighted or patented by somebody else. And if you're politically opposed to this because you understand it violates the Constitution or it violates international law, or even if it violates your faith preference, then other things, including your culture, are allowed to be used in order to try to defame or slander you. I believe I personally have been subjected to a protracted period of time of intentional isolation and alienation from any community I would have willingly engaged with and would have been very generous with. But in the course of so doing, I've been intentionally put into positions where I am compelled to accede to somebody else's political positioning just to get my resource needs met. And in the course, there seems to be some sort of meritocracy on increasing the efforts at humiliation or degradation of me personally, almost as a form of leverage in order to compel me behaviorally to assimilate to somebody else's expectation of my behavior. Now, I've experienced this in an incredibly horrendously anti Semitic manner that's actually even alienated me from people I used to feel very committed to and be very dedicated to who identified as Christian. It's in the course of these heinous acts of anti Semitism, however, that I believe there's also been ethnic cleansing of certain communities of faith that identify as Christian. I haven't had much experience in my life with people that identified as Orthodox Christian. The Christendom I have personally had experience with came from what was offshoots of the Catholic Church. In the short time I did encounter an Orthodox community that had its major faith preferences or faith tradition from outside of the United States, I was subjected to what I understood to be some sort of ritual of anti Semitism, but that was, I believe, orchestrated by individuals within the congregation using their faith praxis as part of a larger political economic paradigm that was also aimed at defaming other people who identify as Christian. I know that people from the countries of the former Soviet Union who may have come from a strong faith tradition experienced a great deal of repression, including fatal repression, during the time frame of the Soviet Union. Not only Jewish people were subjected to this kind of oppression. I can't say I know personally, but perhaps you or members of your community are experiencing something similar. It's important, I think, to understand that when I first went to San Francisco, I did not stay in the major parts of the city that are associated with people that may or may not have been comparable to the people I'd been around before. I didn't even stay on Treasure Island, where I ended up living later, and I ended up meeting a lot of people. I stayed in a part of San Francisco for my first month there that was in a neighborhood of people who had immigrated from the former Soviet Union and may even have had a relationship with the city of San Francisco before the Soviet Union. It was a specific area of town that was known to have a lot of people who were from Russia, who were from the Ukraine, who were from the former Soviet countries, including people that were very religious. And this was the cultural paradigm of the community that I first lived among when I was in San Francisco. I can't say I got to know many people very well, but there was a building that was a church. And while the church was abandoned, pending a transition into what was supposed to be housing, residential housing, the pastor, who was my friend, he told me I could stay in the building under the ownership in the transition from the church to where they were going to make the transition for the housing development. So I stayed in that community for a month. And I believe I was actually witness to something. I believe that beginning in early 2010, there was some sort of paradigm in the city of San Francisco to specifically target people who had ancestry or history or even had been recently immigrated from the countries of the former Soviet Union and may have had a different kind of socio-political perspective than the majority interest that were attempting to concretize their intentions for what they thought San Francisco and the Bay Area was supposed to do and supposed to be. Now, many communities in San Francisco and the Bay Area experience a significant turmoil and transition, some of it very disastrous for different cultures and for different long-term communities. Since the onset of the Affordable Care Act and since other policies that correlated with that. But I'm taking this very personally these days because something has happened, and in the course of this sort of paradigm, there has been way too much saturation of what's allowed to be used as some sort of modality, where the cultural appropriation that is underwriting certain people's ideation of what's acceptable digital commerce or internet technology that plays upon religious themes or cultural archetypes in order to try to create some sort of consumer-based marketplace has been completely unacceptable. And we're not just talking about marketing or branding as a way to try to stimulate consumption. We're literally talking about assimilation of stereotypical depictions of people's cultural heritage so as to actually try to engineer their genotype to exhibit characteristics that will be repeatedly over and over and over again used in underwriting on products they're provided as part of their medical treatment. I know enough about database development, and I've already had plenty of experience and have read enough, including through the judicial branch, regarding earlier forewarnings of how various kinds of database programming, including databases associated with law enforcement, including databases associated with some sort of demographic trending, can actually be used in processes of social and political engineering. And when that's combined with these things that are allowed to masquerade now as quantum marketing, but used to be called infrasonics, including infrasonics having to do with the development of directed energy weapons, now we get into a point where we're at this situation where the refusal to address matters related to the rollout of 3G and the rollout of 4G has taken us into this realm of 5G. And the refusal for anybody to be conscientious in engaging what the actual full-term implications are is very, very disastrous. Now, I know in California there was a movement of people in California, including people that were in professional capacities and including people that had technology industry experience that were talking about either sanctioning or boycotting or altogether dismantling the rollout of 5G. But what's been happening is a lot of people have been trying to promote this concept of a greater investment in the technology sector without even defining what is allowed to be represented as technology. What is the technology sector? And how is it that 5G, for instance, is correlated with COVID 19? I spent a year, and during the course of that year, for at least 3 to 4 months, I followed actively how reports on numbers of deaths and people that were allegedly uh, identified as being sick by COVID 19 matched long term specific hedging and sometimes speculation on a daily basis connected to people doing stock trades or people, the metrics that were part of public reports for major financial banking institutions. Nobody talked about these implications. And I think it's very important because I also spent several years on the street having to go to religious based service providers that would literally hedge metrics that would show up on the city council agenda later that week on homeless people trying to get food that were required to go to a religious based provider that also required them to participate in some form of religious instruction, including prayer, for them to be able to get food and to get clothing. And I'm very, very concerned that what's happened is people of faith have actually had their ceremonies and their rituals appropriated, and somebody patented or copyrighted elements of their liturgy and actually used them in some sort of product line that has nothing to do with what people of faith are really interested in or want to do with their faith praxis. And in the course of this, some product lines think that they have a right to make exclusive claim to certain consumers or certain people that they've already used in R&D. So if you're someone like me, who for a while was secular materialist but identified culturally as Jewish, well, you have 20 years of subjection to different kinds and flavors and brands of anti Semitism trying to compel you to agree to convert to this kind of Christian or this kind of Christian or this kind of Christian. And now we're literally talking about international finance. We're literally talking about financial regimes obligating people to hundreds of millions of dollars again in this completely disgusting, horrendous, hateful, persecutorial methodology. I'm concerned that in the late 90s, I unwittingly was ensnared in some process where I was used as a loan for somebody else in other parts of the world that had a different cultural perspective or different religious perspective. And what ended up happening is I made choices politically that did not correlate with people who had these particular finance portfolios, expectations of what they wanted their instruments to do. And so as I did things that I thought I was doing on one level rationally, they were orchestrating in order to try to recalibrate. And I was just supposed to completely write off my culture and completely write off my personal history because it wasn't convenient to somebody's concept of refinancing. Well, now, unfortunately, I believe I'm witnessing the third round of doing that very thing. And the positive thing is that with this situation we're going through this year, with the decommissioning of the Lieber Index, I think there's a whole realm nobody's talking about what that Lieber Index was based on. And I have absolutely no intention of letting them just sign it up to have another national characterization and have different groups that are supposed to be subjected to ritual humiliation in order to prioritize or better index other groups when it comes to financial hedging or speculation. And I'm concerned if we don't actually take action now, that's what they're going to do. And so the question of looking at which group we can subject to which ratio of persecution so that we can make it most lucrative in the long term while we literally, racially and demographically engineer a certain proportion of people at the startup is completely contemptible to me. I hope that you agree as well. And I also hope that when we finally get to meet again, we're able to get beyond this sort of incipient phase where every day It's a persecutorial religious test to prove you're not as Jewish as you used to be. Or maybe you're not as Christian as you used to be in this regard. I'm really hoping that this settles it permanently and altogether.